What's up guys, today we're finishing the last part of the Highlander analysis where we'll be looking at the in-game moves and some of his finishers. Since this is the last part for Highlander, that means we're going to be moving on to another hero next, and that means to go to the community poll. Go vote on what hero you want to see next. I'll have a link in the description, pinned comment, annotations, it's everywhere, so go vote. Also, if you end up liking this video, please hit the like button. It costs you nothing and it helps get this video out to others. So with all that out of the way, let's talk about Highlander. Now, we talked a bit about Highlander's sword in the first video, and we mentioned how his sword is more of a ahistorical abomination than it is a claymore. So for this video, we aren't going to treat it like a claymore, but rather we are going to talk about it in a sense that is more relatable to it, as a greatsword. Now, we talked about greatswords a bit when we did our Warmonger analysis. We mostly mentioned Zweihanders, but we also talked about Montantes and Spadonas as well. It doesn't matter because when it comes down to the fundamentals of their purpose and how they're used, they're roughly the same. So before we look at any of the animations itself, let's ask ourselves a question. Why would you need a sword this big? Well, to answer that, like all weapons of greater lengths like spears, Dane axes, various polearms, etc., you get much greater reach. You have the ability to reach out with less worry about overexposing yourself, whether that be for using the weapon to fend off an opponent who has a shorter weapon, or whether it's combating a line of pikemen. The fundamental reason is the same. You got a big sword because you want to reach further. Now that we've established that, let's look at some of the animations in-game. Like always, we start with the stances. Let's look at his defensive stance first. For starters, his left and right guards are very similar. What is nice is that he's properly switching the guards but does not change his dominant hand. What I mean by that is you can see that both guards has his right hand closest to the cross guard at all times. This is the proper way to hold a sword, and I mentioned, well, probably on every hero with a sword that I've done a video on so far, but I particularly mentioned this on my Warmonger video because she quite literally throws her sword side to side and runs the risk of dropping it. I also mentioned that you don't need to remove your dominant hand to cut with the sword from either side, and the same is true for here. Besides the use of proper hand placement, the footwork is actually surprisingly good as well. It's actually very similar to Warden, who also use good footwork, in the way that there's proper spacing for stability, and the feet are pointed in the right direction. Very solid. The only issue I would say is that the sword itself is held quite low down. I personally raise it up more, that way making it much more readily available to strike. We'll come back to that though when we talk about attacks. Next, the defensive top guard. This is also a very good guard. The footwork is the same, so no need to delve into that again. The sword placement itself is actually very good. It's essentially a form of wrath guard. German longsword term, I know. I don't know enough about Montante to know what terms they're using for their greatsword, so everyone's just going to have to work with me on this one. Anyways, the term wrath guard comes from the idea that it is the most fundamental form of throwing a cut that will be thrown out of wrath. If you were to give a sword to anyone, especially those who do not practice sword-based martial arts, and you told them to cut at something, they would bring their sword back behind them like so, and then proceed to throw a cut from there. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that this is a form that is for the untrained. I'm saying that this is the most biomechanically instinctual form that our bodies want to use when we throw a cut that intends to just cleave someone in half. So overall, giving Highlander the Wrath Guard is a very fitting form for him, and he is also doing the position pretty well, all things considered. Next, we're going to look at offensive stance guards. Well, I guess they aren't guards as they can't guard anything, but you get the point. For starters, we will begin with the right side. This is essentially what we would call the rear guard. Italian longsword calls it the tail, if I can remember correctly. Either way, this looks fine, and the footwork is fine too. Overall, this would look good if it made sense. This is what is deliberately called the offensive stance, yet you pose less of a threat from this guard. In my opinion, it'd make more sense if the offensive stance and the defensive stance guards were swapped. Having your sword presented and ready to swing from multiple angles is much more offense-minded than having your sword behind you and limited to the number of angles from that guard. Not to mention that the core of this weapon's advantages lie within its reach, not its speed. We'll go more into the flaws of the offensive stance concept as we go through the video, but as for the idea or the implementation of the rear guard, it's fine. It looks good. Next, we're going to look at the left side offensive stance guard. The same issues we had with the other one, but this time it also removed the dominant hand from the top of the hilt. Again, like I said, this is unnecessary. You can perform a majority of your sword attacks from each side without removing your dominant hand. This guard particularly does trip people up even in the real world, but they just have to realize that they have to cross their arms. Then once they practice that, it all starts becoming natural. Another thing that you'll notice is that when swapping guards in offensive stance, instead of moving the weapon side to side, Highlander moves his body side to side. It is quick in the game because the developers make it quick, but the truth is that it is always quicker to move your arms than it would be to shift your entire body weight. Even if it wasn't, it still wouldn't make sense to take your eyes off the opponent and present your back to the enemy. Also, to double down on maintaining the use of your dominant hand, even if we were to use Highlander's weird body twirl guard switch, we can still keep our dominant hand in place. Next, we are looking at the top side offensive stance guard, and oh boy is this one bad. Again, I call it like I see it. I praise the first few ones because they deserve praise, but when I get one that is just straight turbo garbage, I can't ignore it. So let's start with the criteria that he was passing with every single one of the other guards up until now. His footwork, or rather the lack thereof. He's just standing there. I just don't understand how he was doing so well, and then there's just this one oddball stance that is completely off the mark. This dude is asking to get pushed around because he has no stability. Speaking of no stability, we talked about why having only one hand on a sword that is definitely meant to have two was a bad idea on the Warmonger analysis video, but this is on a whole nother level. At least Warmonger points the sword in the general direction of the opponent. Highlander here is just keeping it behind him. It will make even less sense once we get around to talking about attacks. Let's move on to blocking for now though. Whenever I do these videos, I always learn something new about the hero that I never noticed before. In this case, it would be the blocking. To start, we have the light attack blocks. As you can see, the point of the defender's sword stays up as he presents it forward and meets the attacker's blow. Not really interesting or much to talk about. Now you would think that the Highlander would just do the same thing that other heroes do when it comes to heavy attacks and just use the same block animation but stumble 5 feet back like he downed a bottle of vodka. But actually, there's a whole different animation. Instead of keeping his point up and reaching out to meet his opponent, he instead inverts his sword so the point is facing down to essentially perform a hanging guard. Now you might remember me talking about hanging guards a bit when you watched my CGI For Honor video. I say when and not if, because the entire planet apparently showed up to watch that trailer, and to this day I still do not know why. That aside, the very basic idea is that when you angle your sword this way, you create a slope that the opponent's weapon can glide off of. Think of it like how roofs are built angled so that rain can slide off of it and into the gutter. There are a few issues with his hanging guards though. For starters, they look really poor. Like usually I give this game a little bit of slack because it is a video game and there needs to be room for error, but he really wouldn't have blocked anything with those guards. Next is that those guards are intended to set yourself up for retaliation. What I mean by that is while the opponent is forced to follow through with their cut and all their forward momentum is being directed away from your body due to your guard, you're in prime position to retaliate with your own attack. We even saw a bit of this concept in the CGI trailer. That being said, Highlander can't and doesn't do anything close to this. I still think it is really cool though, especially that he treats lights and heavies differently. Next, let's look at parries. To start, we'll look at the top parry. It is very similar to other sword users' parries. Highlander braces his sword with his other arm to try and prevent the sword from blowing through his guard. Then he displaces the opponent's sword. It's not bad. There are other ways to go about it, but this is fine so long as you know how to do it without chopping your hands off. He at least understands how leverage works here. Next, on his side attacks, you can see that he tries to control the opponent's weapons from a hanging guard with only the leverage being on the hilt. This doesn't work well because he doesn't have as much control over his weapon comparatively to how much opposite force is being applied. Now, even if he were able to apply resistant opposite force to it, like he's doing in this situation, it would still fail to attacks that have much more control and force, like Highlander's opener lights. Speaking of which, let's move into attacks now, starting with Highlander's neutral lights. To begin, he has a half-swording light from all sides, where he grips the blade before attacking. This is fantastic, especially for such a long sword like this. In close quarters one-on-one engagements, you have to have good weapon manipulation if you plan on having successful edge control. Unfortunate that a non-knight hero has better sword fundamentals than some of the knights. Anyways, this opener light can also be used as a crushing counter from any side, a feature that I had been asking for on Warden for literal years at this point. The follow-up light attacks is actually really nice as well, as it is just a quick swing. It's simple and it makes sense. To explain why I like this one so much, I'm going to have to jump back and forth between neutral and offensive stance, so bear with me. Next we are looking at offensive stance lights. Pretty much from all sides, it doesn't make sense. It's just a pommel strike. Don't get me wrong, a pommel strike can be very debilitating and can do some serious damage, but In what world would this actually work? You're using the shortest, bluntest side of your weapon that is, on average, heavier than most other weapons. The only reason this works in game is due to the insane amount of magnetism this attack seems to have, and the fact that he's able to perform such attacks at unrealistic speeds. The truth is, the opener light animation should have been his offensive stance attacks, the normal follow-up light should have been his neutral attacks, and the pommel strikes should have stayed in guard breaks, bashes, and grappling where they belong. Half swording is an inherently offensive and close quarters technique. The fact that they didn't think it would work well in this offensive stance is insane. The fact that they thought the pommel strikes were a viable move to put in offensive stance in the first place is insane. This is just the beginning of why the idea of an offensive stance just doesn't really make sense with a weapon like this. Let's move on to heavy attacks now, bringing it back to the neutral stance and starting with openers. There isn't much to talk about here. For starters, the heavy opener is very telegraphed and it looks like he's swinging a 20-pound sword. For those who still might not understand by now, which if you're watching my previous videos you definitely should by now, swords are not unreasonably heavy. These are weapons that are meant to be carried and swung by soldiers all day long. If it was ridiculously heavy, no one would use it. Great swords on average were like 5 to 7 pounds. That is very heavy for a sword, but in the grand scheme of things, that's not heavy at all compared to things like groceries you might have carried. There's a reason why people may think they are heavy, and that is they may see some people use them who are untrained and see them swing wildly and without coordination. This is not due to it being too heavy, but usually due to it being unwieldy. Great swords are definitely front-heavy swords, and they demand the capability of working with his momentum. We'll talk more about momentum in a bit. Anyways, Highlander's opener heavies are very overdramatic, his follow-up heavies are less overdramatic, but still very much telegraphed. Switching back over, let's look at offensive stance heavies. The side ones aren't bad at all. In fact, they look very similar to the neutral heavies in some way. I don't know for sure though. The top heavy isn't that bad either, but I just want to point out, again, just like Warmonger, he holds the sword with one hand. But then, when he swings the sword, he uses both hands. This is a waste of movements. What is he doing? If he was just going to swing with both hands anyways, why move your hand off of it? What is he, tired? All that muscle, but you're just getting tired holding up your left arm for more than 5 seconds? It's just... I'm going to freaking lose it. Some of the design choices are fantastic, and then the other ones just make you question where they got their concept of fighting or cool from. While we are on the subject of heavy attacks, we might as well talk about Celtic Curse. So just the base Celtic Curse is bad. In fact, it looks very familiar, but I just don't know where. One of the things that make this bad is just how he leaves himself open when he gets on his tippy toes. He's essentially saying, look, my sword is behind me, stab me, tackle me, do almost anything because I am powerless to stop it. Just a reminder, there is no hyper armor in real life. All flesh cuts the same. And you will get insta-clapped if someone with a sword knows what they're doing. Pair this with the fact that if the opponent was fucking sleeping or something, I don't know, then the sword would follow through into the floor. You have the same situation as Warmonger's top heavy. Strange, isn't it? It's almost like Warmonger has a lot in common with other heroes. Anyways, his sword hits the floor and then he has to pick it back up. Obviously his recovery time in-game is quick because it's a video game. They can make the animations instantaneous if they wanted to, but in real life you put yourself in a real bad position like this. With your weapon on the floor, you pose no threat. Not just that, but you also leave your upper torso and head exposed, the two things that contain a majority of your vital organs. Bad times indeed. With all that being said, Celtic Curse soft feint into ballerina twirl isn't so bad in my opinion. Baiting an opponent into thinking that you're actually going to do something and then doing something else is a tried and true tactic. Honestly, that was the fundamental idea the move has in-game as well. People will think that you're going in for the top heavy and then you spin into the side. Even though the top attack is quite obvious, the same is true in-game. It doesn't matter if it's obviously bait, now you have to worry about an attack that can come from anywhere. Just because it's obviously bait doesn't mean that you know where the attack is coming from. That being said, the follow-through for the spin is pitiful, and he releases his sword with one hand. Now we're getting into things like spinning for an attack, and I think that means it's a perfect time to move on to our next topic. Let's talk about his zone attack. I actually really like it, and here's why. I and other people in the weapon-based martial arts community have always harped on spinning attacks. There is a reason for it, and if you don't know, you gotta go watch my other videos. I'm at like page 5 of the script here, and this video isn't even close to done. I don't have time to explain. But for the people who do know why spinning attacks don't work, then understand that is for smaller weapon systems on a one-on-one basis. So if I had a katana or something and I tried to do a spinning attack to a guy who was looking right at me, then that is obviously going to get me killed. The thing is though, the greatsword was designed not just to take on one person. You could use it for that and be very successful, but it was designed to give you much greater length to be a force multiplier. With this extra length, you could essentially take on 2 opponents at once if you know what you're doing. I've shown footage before of proper montante techniques in my Warmonger video, and I'd like to show you it again with an emphasis on the actual situational use of these moves. You'll see that these techniques are used when outnumbered and being surrounded. One of the benefits is being able to keep your opponents at bay. Essentially what I'm getting at is if you turn into a Beyblade hard enough, then no one can get close enough to hurt you. It's like Conqueror's Zone, but actually looks cool. So why did I go on that massive monologue? Because this zone attack fulfills that exact purpose. When was the last time that you used the Highlander zone in a 1v1? Probably never, unless it was an accident, right? Now when was the last time that you used Highlander zone to clear mid? Or use Highlander zone to kill an unlocked opponent in a gank? Point proven. There are very rare times that the concept of an attack actually fits not just the game, but real life as well. As for how the technique looks in-game, it's not bad until he removes his hand on the second swing, but then he puts it back for the final one. Also, he gets stuck in a recovery animation for his final swing, and it looks like he's in left side Wrathguard. They should have made the zone attack come from the left side, so that way the animation ends, he is on his right side Wrathguard, and it can essentially fast flow into his offensive stance. But hey, I'm not a game developer, so what do I know? Anyways, speaking of wide sweeping attacks, we have the running attack. I like this attack a lot as well because he doesn't spin. Okay, backtracking a bit. I did say spinning is okay with this weapon because you do have a lot of reach, but don't spin if you don't have to. For example, if no one is behind you, don't turn your back to the enemy in front of you. Focus on them instead of taking a look around. As for this attack, the swings are telegraphed, they always are, and he looks a bit silly running forward while swinging. That being said, it is a running attack and I have to look past that. So overall, it's not bad. Now, regretfully, let's talk about the kick. It's not good, guys. It's really freaking high for a kick. I don't know if you guys realize this, but at full extension, his kick looks like Tiandi's. It's just not viable in a weapon-based combat system. A small kick to the shins, maybe, but nothing like this. Next, caber toss. This is equally as bad. No one is just going to let you grab them. You're just asking for a close quarters grapple at that point, and you're both going to end up on the floor. That being said, if you were to surprise them, or you're just able to somehow get yourself to the point where you can grab them like this, it is smart to throw them to the floor. Then you should be able to do something like Warmonger's out of stamina parry punish. Next, I'm not talking about kick into caber toss. It hurts my head and makes me sad. Finally, let's talk about guard breaks and throws. The initial guard break is pretty normal. It's a quick upwards pommel strike. Why this one doesn't do damage but the other ones from offensive stance do is something I will never understand, nor will I try. Chalk it up with another Yubiism. Forward throw is pretty good because it's just a quick shoulder check. Nothing tells your opponent back off quite like a shove from close quarters using your entire body weight. Next we have backwards throw, which is pretty similar to Warden's backwards throw, in which he uses the hilt to grapple the enemy and then throw them behind. Honestly, you have much more control of your opponent this way than you would with just one hand. This should have been the caber toss, and the one hand should have been the one that throws him backwards. Then we have the side throws, nothing special, just some shoves side to side. This video has gone on for so long that I almost forgot that I still have to talk about finishers. I'm only going to go over briefly just a few notable ones in an attempt to keep this video below 20 minutes. To start, we have one of the best default finishers in the game in my opinion, Intent to Behead. This is particularly good because it's straight and to the point, but is also very believable too. The sheer momentum of him pulling out the sword and then incorporating that momentum into the swing brings us back to the original point that we were talking about earlier with momentum. Next, we're looking at No Mercy. The very ironic thing is that this is actually a pretty textbook mercy kill. If he were to leave his opponent without a limb, subsequent blood loss would most certainly kill them, and assuring that they don't have 21st century medical technology, there would be no real way to stop this from happening. Wounds this severe on the battlefield can only be quelled one way, and that's putting the person out of their misery. So, in fact, the Highlander is very merciful as he made their death quick. Next, we're going to take a look at 360 Takedown, mostly to talk about how striking with the hilt doesn't work like that. There are some examples of pointed quillons on the crossguard, presumably to make hilt strikes more deadly, but to assume that it would just impale someone on the back like this is improbable to say the least. I don't want to say that it's impossible, but you would have to be generating a lot of force to impale that much, especially if the opponent is wearing armor. Finally, we're going to look at Bone Crusher. This is actually a pretty good example of how to use the hilt to strike someone with. Notice how the first strike is at a point of weakness. It is a very deliberate move to hit someone in a place to incapacitate them. Very quickly after that, it is followed up with the killing blow to the head. This one is actually a lot more solid than I would have thought it had been. That's going to be it for this one, guys. A bit longer than usual. I try to keep it to the most essential information, but even then I just have a lot to say. Before I say anything else, my quick shout out to my YouTube members. Thank you so much, particularly Grant Bork for being the highest tier member. Hopefully I pronounced that right. If you want to become a member and support the content I make, the join button is down below. Speaking of buttons, please hit the like button if you enjoyed this video. It will help get this video out to other people. If you're new here, consider subscribing as well, as it'll keep you up to date when my videos drop. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or great sword experience that you'd like to share, please go ahead and leave it down below. Last but certainly not least, go participate in the poll. It'll be up for roughly about a week, maybe more, so go vote on what hero you want to see next. Now with all that being said, thank you for watching and I'll see you next video. Peace.